It's just so hard for me to get.
Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Hillary Carr, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce tonight's event with Corey Dolgon, presenting his latest book, Kill It to Save It, an autopsy of capitalism's triumph over democracy. And so now, I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's author, presenting his acclaimed new book, Kill It to Save It, an autopsy of capitalism's triumph over democracy. Corey Dolgon is a professor of sociology and the director of the Office of Community-Based Learning at Stonehill College, where he is known for performing singing lectures on the role of folk songs in labor organizing and other social movements. He is the author of 3 other books, including The End of the Hamptons, Scenes from the Class Struggle in America's Paradise, the winner of the 2005 Book Prize from the Association for Humanist Sociology. Kill It to Save It explores the hypocrisy of current U.S. political discourse, examining the trajectory of capitalism's triumph over democracy through the interconnected issues of globalization, neoliberalism, and declining public institutions. Eduardo Bonilla Silva, the author of Racism Without Racists, said that Kill It to Save It is required reading for those hoping not only to resist Trumpism, but envision a new left for the 21st century. And Robin D.G. Kelly, author of Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, called it clear-eyed and perceptive, mandatory reading if we are to replace the neoliberal common sense with radical possibilities of good sense. Please join me in welcoming Corey Dolgon.
Thank you, Hillary. Sorry about that. Thank you. Thanks to Hillary and Maddie and all the folks here at Harvard Bookstore for doing the hard work of not only setting this up, but actually getting everybody in. So, acclaim, that's always a funny word, I guess. What is this book? It's too new to have acclaim, I think. I may have a claim, but I don't think I've received a claim quite yet. But I do appreciate the very kind words of the introduction. And I do talk about the hypocrisy of contemporary American political thought. I don't know that will distinguish this book much. As we say, it's kind of like shooting fish in a barrel nowadays. But I do hope there are things that distinguish the book. And I want to thank everybody for coming out and hopefully hanging out. I don't think it'll get too hot in here, so I think the temperature is quite good, so we should be fine for about an hour. I'll try and finish up on the early side, and people who feel cheated can join us next door at Grafton Street. Is that what you suggested? A couple doors down, so we can continue the conversation, perhaps a little more lively over there. And finally, I wanted to thank especially a number of family and friends here, although I'm surprised at how many of you I don't know. But you know, we're friends now. We're friends now. And you're locked at 20% off, so thanks again to the bookstore. But I have so many friends and mentors here, including Professor Jerry Lemke, who I kid is the midwife for this book in many ways. Jerry also reminds me how important bookstores are, and I think you all coming out tonight is a reminder that community and independent bookstores are one of the hopefully not disappearing, but certainly threatened fabric of contemporary culture. Jerry says book culture. I think actually civic culture as well. And so I think that the dynamics of reading change when we have these kinds of activities. And I want to challenge us all to make sure we keep these stores alive. And so for those of you tempted to buy books on Amazon, as I sometimes am myself, one of the things to recall is that almost all independent bookstores nowadays can order books online. And so if you're looking for the ease of ordering books online, please order from Harvard or both people in Austin or Elliott Bay Books in Seattle, but all these great independent bookstores all over the country. Please do that. But there are so many family and friends here. And mentors. I have to say, this is, in some ways, this is like a cross between my dissertation defense and a bar mitzvah. I don't know that I've had people paying this much attention to me in a long time, including my family. So, thank you to everyone for coming out. I'm going to read for about 20 or 25 minutes, and then we should have at least 20 minutes or so for questions. Probably more questions than answers, unless people in the audience have answers. I started the book with a quotation from C. Wright Mills. This is from the introduction. Nowadays, people often feel that their private lives are a series of traps. They sense that within their everyday worlds, they cannot overcome their troubles. And in this feeling, they're often quite correct. What ordinary people are directly aware of and what they try to do are bounded by the private orbits in which they live. Neither the life of an individual nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding both. In many ways, this book is a political history and analysis of my own life. In it, I examine the contours of American politics and culture over the last half-century in an effort to understand what went wrong. For those of us late bloomers born to Kennedy's New Frontier and reared in the bosom of the suburban middle class, the world seemed full of progress and possibility. My father marched for civil rights and change came. He protested against the war in Vietnam and it ended. My mother chaired the local parent-teacher association and a corrupt principal was fired. The world had many problems, but if people organized and fought for progressive solutions, they could change things for the better. By the time I reached high school, my American history teacher's mantra, "There is no retrograde step to democracy," seemed to be the social and political law of the land. Yet even the best of what American imperialism offered its citizens after 1960 could not help but be ripped apart by its own contradictions. Moving commodity production and its attendant exploitation overseas eventually degraded wages and working conditions everywhere. Spreading democracy through barbarity may have protected friendly dictators, but it inspired nationalist and fundamentalist blowback. Conflating values of progress and prosperity with religious piety, patriotic arrogance, and mass consumption made the stalwart of America's 20th century identity, the middle class, only more nervous, frustrated, and ultimately depressed. Global brutality and suffering combined with creeping fear and guilt at home kept everyone from sleepwalking too comfortably through the end of the American century. The nightmare was the reality, the dream a myth. By the time I reached college in 1980, the world was already seeming different. The oil crisis and economic malaise of the late 1970s had made people in my community uneasy. Unemployment and uncertainty broke through the once confident concrete sidewalks of suburbia. Love Canal and other environmental catastrophes suggested that some of our most dangerous threats were invisible, lurking beneath our backyard barbecues or pouring out from our kitchen taps. Powerful and debilitating drugs had seeped into suburban schools, and stories spread about pushers and dealers and addicts. The horror films of the late 1970s and mid-1980s depicted a society of maniacal, gluttonous adults and spoiled, hedonistic youth, witnessing their comfortable, self-satisfied, and mostly white worlds implode. From the Stepford Wives to Carrie, from Nightmare on Elm Street to Blue Velvet, something was amiss in America's middle-class communities that on film literally devoured them from the inside out. Meanwhile, as redlining, blockbusting, speculation, and racism fueled white fears and white flight, our once integrated neighborhood in Hempstead, Long Island, rapidly became a majority Black and Latino community. In fact, for once mildly liberal whites, the conflation of economic insecurity and changing neighborhoods convinced some that perhaps civil rights had gone too far, and their new neighbors were actually to blame for increased economic hardships in their community, and the growing influx of drugs in their schools, and the overall sense that the urban sprawl of social problems had ruined their suburban utopia. Something was going wrong, but without a strong analysis of what and why, many middle-class white people simply moved further away from traditional suburbs towards an ever-elusive anti-urban landscape. But this time, they would be far less tolerant and far less liberal. My parents vowed to stay in our neighborhood, but when my father lost his job and the family landed on food stamps, we followed him to new employment outside of Philadelphia in southern New Jersey. Within 3 years, he would lose that job too and begin a downward spiral, leading him and my mother towards forced early retirement and a debt-ridden, stress-filled existence at a coastal Maine trailer park. To make a few dollars, my dad started a newsletter of political ramblings called the Dolgon Chronicles, part insightful analysis, part polemic, and part Borscht Belt shtick. He sold subscriptions to friends, family, and activist colleagues and like-minded acquaintances. I think some of you here may have been subscribers, actually. He entitled his first front-page editorial Downsized and argued that one could witness the destruction of contemporary economic and public policy one life at a time, in particular his, but that the trend towards increased oligarchic wealth for the few and increased poverty and powerlessness for the majority would soon mean that his story would be the norm. My dad never read The Sociological Imagination, but he always had one. The radical transformation of American society between 1990 and the early 2000s was not only about the structural, economic, and geographic shifts that shape the volatile and stressful lives we lead in what is now called the global economy. After all, my early lessons taught me that people could act collectively to address social problems, and with enough intellectual acumen, organizing ability, and political will, the world could be changed for the better. But the structural transformation of the late 20th and early 21st centuries were accompanied by a cultural, social, and psychological paradigm that leaves many people stupefied into paralysis or bamboozled into believing such changes are actually good for them. Many Americans support and even espouse an economy that creates hyper-inequality. We welcome policies that weaken public institutions and infrastructures which for decades bolstered whatever real social mobility workers ever had. And we cheer laws that decrease democracy and hinder opportunities to organize for change, despite our diminished ability to alter America's course and protect the public good. Such contradictions form the cornerstone of Donald Trump's campaign and are at the foundation of what I call kill it to save it. Now, I came upon this trend towards self-defeating social policies as I tried to understand the changing ways in which my students thought about the world around them. I think some of them are here tonight too, and I am talking about you. After many years of teaching in higher education at institutions both public and private, working class and elite, I noticed that college students aged 18 to 25 grew increasingly uneasy at the social contract they had entered into. Yet they seemed unaware of and even antagonistic towards thinking that such problems might have to do with structural changes or need to be addressed with collective political action. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, students could still believe that if they worked moderately hard and did above average in school, they would graduate with access to what then seemed a comfortable middle-class lifestyle. They expected a modicum of economic security, leisure, and consumption based on a public institutional landscape that ensured decent employment, education, healthcare, housing, and the possibility of working harder for more. My students had yet to really experience the impact that dismantling public institutions, privatizing collective consumption, and delegitimizing the very value of the public good would have on their futures. By the mid-1990s, however, students were already facing an uncertain financial future. Despite Bill Clinton's quote-unquote economic miracle, the prospects for many undergraduates had dwindled. For those in business and engineering, opportunities still seemed bright, but those in the humanities and social sciences already faced jokes about living in their parents' basement and flipping Big Macs. Unemployment reached historic lows, but the kinds of jobs most college graduates expected to get also changed significantly. Master's and professional degrees beckoned as mandatory. Meanwhile, Reagan-era cuts in public funding for higher education and the skyrocketing costs of colleges competing for students who could pay full tuition, luxury dorms, upscale food service, athletic facilities, high-speed everything, had increased the price tag for undergraduate degrees exponentially, leaving most graduates in serious and now crippling debt. The first decade of the 2000s witnessed a student body self-described as highly stressed and more likely to be emotionally unstable, economically insecure, and more worried about the future than ever before. Few expected to do better than their parents, even first-generation college students, and most had no idea how they would pay off their debts. Many never did, and now never do. Despite these significant challenges brought on by global economic changes and federal policies that destroyed working and middle-class confidence, students have no critical analysis or effective ideological framework to understand what happened. Resonating with C. Wright Mill's observation, America once again seemed trapped. I would now add threatened, and as Donald Trump exposed, increasingly angry, but now lack a sociological imagination with which to escape. And with no one really to blame, students increasingly blame themselves, or they try to self-medicate or escape. Alcohol and drug abuse are up on college campuses, as are psychiatric drugs and attempted suicide. And when students don't hurt themselves, they lash out at others in often violent and counterproductive ways that, when intertwined with toxic masculinity, racism, and xenophobia, fuel the increase of sexual assault and hate crimes on campus. My students' futures and now presents have grown dim, but they lack both the intellectual fortitude to figure out why and the instinct for collective engagement to change it. Ironically, they continue to support the same anti-public policies that destroyed the possibility of their middle-class aspirations in the first place. But why? In Tom Frank's What's the Matter with Kansas, he contends that despite the negative impact that ultra-conservative economic policies have on most working and middle-class Kansans, they support ultra-conservative policies because they share a common view on hot-button social issues such as abortion and creationism. I think his narrative has become relatively common and certainly echoed quite a bit after this last election. Frank writes, not long ago, Kansans would have responded to the current economic situation by making the bastards pay. This would have been a political certainty as predictable as what happens when you touch a match to a puddle of gasoline. When business screwed the farmers and the workers, when it implemented monopoly strategies invasive beyond the populace's furthest imaginings, when it ripped off shareholders and casually tossed thousands out of work, you could be damn sure what would happen next. Not these days. Out here, the gravity of discontent pulls only in one direction, to the right, further to the right. Strip today's Kansans of their job security and they head out to become registered Republicans. Push them off their land and the next thing you know, they're protesting in front of abortion clinics. Squander their life savings on manicures for the CEO, and there's a good chance they'll join the John Birch Society. But ask them about remedies that their ancestors proposed, unions, antitrust, public ownership, and you might as well be referring to the days when knighthood was in flower. Frank's basic argument seems sound, and his tour de force of cultural politics in the heartland offers some of the best critique of the past decade or so. The salience of his explanation simply begs the question, what's the matter with Oklahoma, Nebraska, Tennessee, Mississippi, Maine, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and almost everywhere else in the United States? Frank's approach to the how and why of such social transformation, however, rests primarily on an analysis of conservative political strategy and tactics. Essentially, he contends that a socially conservative electorate stands at the ready, ripe for the picking by neoconservatives. These neocons, he implies, front-load a good controversy over the Pledge of Allegiance and late-term abortion every time they want to gather the troops to vote for corporate-pocketed candidates like schools or prisons, who will reduce taxes on the rich or privatize public institutions like schools or prisons. The strategy calls for mobilizing the white working and middle class. The tactics call for identifying the right hot-button social issue for the right campaigns. Even better if political rhetoric can be racially coded and echo deep historical and cultural themes of white supremacy. In many ways, Frank assumes that a vein of false consciousness in American culture not only exists, but can be easily tapped by devious right-wing political strategists. I don't disagree in theory, but the term false consciousness has always been complicated and rightly criticized as an elite a priori assumption that the poor and working class are easily duped. Conversely, intellectuals know better what is in the interest of workers, who once properly enlightened would instinctively coalesce based on their structural position in relations to capital production. It sounds right theoretically as well, but then so does trickle-down economics. Instead, I would contend that consciousness and identity are much more fluid and complex. As social critic Michael Apple wrote, the first thing to ask about an ideology is not what is false about it, but what is true. Ideologies do not dupe people. Thus, I argue that the same group of Kansans that once looked towards unions, populist, socialists, and radical collective action for solutions to their problems could do so again. And the reason they turned away from these allies and strategies so drastically in the first place tells us less about their self-denial, as Frank puts it, than about a differently constructed sense of self and identity, which, while it has developed over the last 4 decades, is as old as the nation itself. The conservative instinct now guiding most Americans' political choices comes from a bewildered yet leaden blood plodding through their patriotic veins, tightening in their chests and haunting their dreams. In essence, Kill It to Save It represents a sense of individualistic freedom, entrepreneurial bluster, and post-racial complacency that Americans, especially white Americans, want to believe about themselves and their country, regardless of the facts, experiences, and political history that exposes the fallacy. The resulting disappointment, fear, stress, paranoia, and cognitive dissonance clot any critical imagination and constrict any real social awareness. But they clearly fueled both Donald Trump's campaign and the Democratic Party's paralysis in response. Using Mill's concept, Kill It to Save It is an ideological, psychological, and even physiological trap. What is Kill It to Save It? What I argue in the book is that the past half-century has witnessed a new ideological paradigm which shapes political consciousness and decision-making with a toxic blend of corporate hegemony and hyper-individualism. This cultural and political framework evolved over the last 50 years to legitimize the convergence of neoconservative and neoliberal policies, mostly among a vast swath of primarily white working, middle, and professional class voters who once supported the New Deal and its emergent welfare state, but no longer. The power of Kill It to Save It emanates not so much from the strategic force or tactical acumen of right-wing spin doctors and charismatic gas bags, simply duping the American public. Rather, this new ideology's durability comes from the realignment of narrowly constructed but widely held capitalist core values and a deeply mythological sense of who we are and should be as Americans. In essence, it represents the narrative battle over the cultural and historical hardwiring of American society that the new left of the 1960s and 70s eventually lost to the new right of the 1980s and 1990s. This newly dominant cultural and political frame promotes the supposed resurrection of absolutely free individuals no longer enslaved by public programs or collective goods and responsibilities. Thus, the it being saved may have once been a public good like education or healthcare, but according to Kill It to Save It policymaking, can only be maintained today by getting rid of the public part. For example, to save mass public education, it must be replaced by a privatized charter system in which individuals choose to buy and sell what becomes known as educational services. Education becomes not a public mission available to everyone, but rather a private commodity purchased by each individual. To save Medicare and Medicaid, we must privatize them for individuals to buy on their own. Even Social Security, the mother lode of welfare state policies that support and protect mostly senior citizens, is under attack. Politicians and marketeers argue that the only way to maintain this program in the face of an aging baby boomer generation is to supplant it with personal retirement accounts. But as economists Dean Baker and Mark Weisbrod have written, the only real threat to Social Security comes not from any fiscal or demographic constraints, but from the political salts in the program by would-be reformers. Social Security is eternally viable, dependent only on political decisions to establish the revenue necessary to fund it. Despite the actual numbers that prove Weisbrod and Baker's case, privatization proponents have the advantage of tapping into a polluted ideological stream of austerity economics and the desire to destroy any public program that suggests social commitments and responsibilities. Choice becomes the language of the newly liberated services, now privatized commodities, with the underlying value-added premise of people seeming to have more freedom. But the it being saved can also be the whole economic and political system. While globalization may have opened up every earthly nook and cranny to commoditization, the ensuing explosion of wealth has reached fewer and fewer people. In part, Kill It to Save It represents the deregulation of environmental standards and the degradation of labor rights, all in the name of liberating markets for greater corporate profits. But neoliberalism has also meant reducing wages, working conditions, job protection, health and safety provisions for workers and their communities, ultimately destroying any semblance of the working and middle class American dream. As well as paying less for labor, health, and environmental costs, corporations have lobbied to pay fewer taxes in pursuit of national austerity and the individual liberation from undue social responsibilities. To save the government and the economy, first we terminate government's ability to regulate, tax, and spend, essentially what governments are supposed to do. Second, we bolster an economic system that produces increased profits for the wealthy, but is no longer charged with making sure that basic necessities and commodities are distributed to maintain the health and well-being of a larger society, essentially what economies are supposed to do. While one theme of Kill It to Save It policy emphasizes corporate hegemony, the social commitment to what's good for business is good for America, the other suggests that corporate hegemony itself somehow liberates individuals to compete more freely without the albatross of social responsibilities and the public good. The phrase "kill it to save it" originated as a justification for destroying Vietnamese villages and killing Vietnamese people to save the country from communism. But the war in Vietnam always represented a desperate, cynical strategy invariably based on a criminal foreign policy belief that nihilistic violence and almost total obliteration could stop the impending movement of people who for centuries sought self-determination and liberation. Such movements can never be stopped permanently. Americans, too, can shake off the intellectual and political shrouds that cover us like corpses walking dead in our own lives. But we must do it together. In the wake of mass killings in Aurora, Sandy Hook, Charleston's Emmanuel AME Church, Umpqua Community College in Oregon, San Bernardino, Orlando, and whatever mass shooting incident happened yesterday, our inability to address the absurdity of policymaking debates seem ever more striking. We can't pass serious regulations on guns, address the poor quality and paucity of mental health care, or change the direction of growing poverty and suffering, even after witnessing time and time and time again the effects of not changing public policies that are, in fact, killing us. Only strong progressive social movements for economic and social equality will create the kinds of fundamental changes needed to change our kill it to save it common sense. They're the only things that ever have. But how do we get there? I finished the introduction with a short section called A Cautionary Tale about the book. As I say here, many of my friends and colleagues who saw various parts of this book while it was being written warned me that periodically they thought about slitting their wrists. One person suggested that I have sections about positive things happening that challenge the kill it to save it paradigm. And such things are happening. And the recent campaigns of both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders suggest serious rumblings against the status quo. But the almost polar opposite platforms of Sanders and Trump suggest that protest and change could lead us to a more democratic public welfare state or towards a more aggressive, brutal oligarchy. Populism cuts both ways. Donald Trump's victory, fueled by an overwhelmingly white male working and middle class electorate, suggests that kill it to save it will continue to be an even more violent and vitriolic movement against public institutions and the public good for years to come, evidence of which occurred again this afternoon. Unlike the incoherent and fragmentary common sense that can easily be marshaled to support the status quo stranglehold of the rich and powerful, we need what Antonio Gramsci called good sense. This mindset requires a critical conception of dominant thinking and a consciousness of who has power and how they use it. In other words, the good sense would inform the cultural mainstream with the critical tools to recognize the ways in which kill it to save it continues to empower corporate and other elite interests over the welfare of poor, working, and middle class Americans, as well as the masses of working people around the world. We need strong yet accessible political, ideological critique focused on the sometimes subtle rhetoric, but often hostile, openly hostile policies of those in power. Such contributions have always been the bone and sinew of the strong progressive left. Thus, the need for radical democracy and the redistribution of wealth and power will require that people have a clear and accessible narrative of how and why things are the way they are and how they got this way. This book aims to provide just such a story. I spend much of my life organizing in communities and educating students to use their intellectual and social skills to change the world. And I believe the only ways to change it are to be collectively active in the process of doing so. But I have watched too many people, myself included, spend too many hours and too much energy on projects whose impact proved negligible. Not because the intentions lack commitment or communities lack talent, but because the framework for action and the theory of change failed to address the paradigm shift necessary to challenge the underlying ideological burden of corporate hegemony and hyper-individualism. A socially just world will not happen until people take to the streets to demand it. But I am convinced at this historical juncture that the prolonged movement necessary to create change cannot occur until we challenge some of the basic cultural precepts that now keep us from building such movements. This book is a story of who we are, where we are, and how we got here. I hope it can inform the next story about how we changed it all. Well, let's go! We'll start with some questions. Ajit.
Back in the late 1800s, the armors and the Swift treated people like dirt.
I'm sorry,
Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
I have to repeat the question for Kristina, who's filming this, so I need to make sure I hear it.
Back late 1800s, early 1900s, capitalist armors and Swift treated people like dirt. Along came Eastman Kodak, started proper working conditions and proper pay, healthcare. He did very well. Currently, given this vicious circle that you and Noam Chomsky talk about, saying campaign finance takes too much money, so the rich interests back him, they get the laws more to their favor, become further. Who's the Eastman Kodak that's going to come and save us?
I don't know. What do you do, Ajit? The question is, if we go back to the late 1800s and early 1900s and the way in which capital worked at that time and the rise of monopoly capitalism and the mistreatment of workers and communities around the country, immigrants, etc. According to Ajit, Eastman Kodak came in and kind of saved the day by providing better working conditions, better wages, etc. And so he's asking, who's going to be the Eastman Kodak of today? I don't know enough about Eastman Kodak to suggest that, but I know enough about American history to say that nobody came in and saved the day, except perhaps unions, right? And so, it was, my reading of American history, and maybe global history, although I'm pitifully America-centered, but, is that, in fact, it was organized people protesting against the worst abuses, whether it was of capitalism or white supremacy or patriarchy, that changed things. And so my question is not really who's going to be the Eastman Kodak. The question is, can we really form strong unions again? And can we form really strong multicultural unions that recognize the need to fight white supremacy and patriarchy and homophobia and all of these different oppressions at the same time? And I really want to suggest, and we can talk a lot more about it, I really want to suggest that what the Democratic Party seems to be wanting to take home from this last election, that they didn't cater to the white working class enough, I think is a real misreading of what the next stage of contemporary politics have to be. And it has to be, we can't kind of juxtapose identity politics and class politics anymore. We have to recognize the integration of these politics and be able to come up with a narrative that says that, as opposed to a narrative that says, oh, I represent all of the different identities, you should vote for me.
Even the unions started to take care of themselves. The Teamsters had a fund. They started to back the mafia. They became just as greedy. They didn't sit down with industry and say, how do we get together and compete with the Japanese?
I don't think you'll find a lot of disagreement in this room for the people I know of with a critique of contemporary unionism and business unionism. But again, if the great failure on the part perhaps of unions has been not to be as rank and file oriented and not to be as inclusive as it should have been when it should have been. But again, I don't think that that's a done deal. I don't think unions haven't disappeared. And strong unions are still out there and doing their best. I think that's got to be one of the areas that we focus more on, not simply as an identity politic of white working class people, but as a class politic of working people from all over.
Like a number of people, I became fairly activated by the events in November, and but I'm in a blue city, in a blue state, and I wonder if you could opine about what people on the edges of the country can do for their fellow man in the current situation. I think there's a lot of frustration about that.
You could move. The question is, if in fact, if you, I guess you're talking about Cambridge. I don't live here. For example, there are a few towns like Cambridge around the country. If you live in a very blue town in a particularly blue state, it seems slightly different to be active than in many other places around the country which aren't as blue. So I don't know if I can answer that question, because I think the answer is the same, right? You need to be active, you need to be politically active, you need to be out trying to not only change policies, but also, as I suggest here, kind of really produce this narrative, right, that suggests that in fact we have to do this together. Well, what the vision of that change in the end is, I don't know. I think people develop visions of a new day while they're struggling to try and change it, right? But I do think you have to have principles, and this book is kind of about how do you kind of analyze the contemporary setting and develop new values for change. Having said that, let me suggest that the answer is the same wherever you are, right? So, I really do think that the whole blue-red dichotomy is it's another kind of media and political produced concept that really works well for fundraising for the Democrats and the Republicans, and it works well for the media because everything, back in the 80s, I remember people talking about how politics had become a sport, right? It's even more so now, right? And it's a huge sport, with a lot more money than baseball or basketball or football. And there are more pundits now on television that do politics than sports, right? So I actually think the more we can challenge the red-blue state dichotomy, and recognize the commonality of a good 80 to 90% of those interests. That is where the tactical, spin doctors do come in. I think we can do a much better job of promoting a much different narrative wherever we are.
Thank you.
You had your hand first.
Yeah, extraordinary subject and a big subject. I'm really impressed. I'm just stuck in my head on one thing.
Sure.
Monopolies and the failure of anti-monopoly legislation. Do you discuss the history of our antitrust legislation at all in this book, and what's happened to that? Is that too specific, or?
Well, for my the question is, do I talk about antitrust legislation in the book?
What's happened to it?
In what's happened. I talk a little bit about the whole notion of corporations becoming individuals.
Yeah.
And so, by association, yes, but I don't get into the nitty gritty. And I try not to copy too many other people, because there's a lot of stuff that people have done. Apparently, as Donald Trump said, it's a little more complicated than we thought. But I would suggest the amazing documentary, The Corporation. I think that brings in a tremendous amount of resources in a very popular and accessible way to understand the history of the idea of the corporation in the United States and how that's kind of taken over. But when I talk about corporate hegemony, that is so much of what I'm talking about, and I spell it out, more theoretically than I do specifically.
Yeah, I'm not old enough to remember Eastman Kodak in 1900s, but
they made cameras and film.
Yeah,
we don't know what that is anymore.
I know that.
Oh, okay.
And I totally agree with you about corporate hegemony. However, when I got out of school, I'm pretty old. When I got out of school in the 1960s, it was very easy to get a job. And so corporate hegemony in the 1960s, I think, was a lot kinder than corporate hegemony
Yeah.
Today,
Yeah.
there's the globalization, technological displacement,
Yeah.
hollowing out of bureaucracies, and furthermore, the skill levels of a lot of companies are just beyond anybody's capability.
That's right.
If you want to get a job with Facebook, you have to graduate from an elite school. You have to have a degree in computer science. You have to be in the top 5% of your class. You have to submit your transcripts going back to kindergarten. I kid you not. I know somebody who had graduated from Cambridge University in England 30 years ago, and he had to call Cambridge and provide his transcripts.
But not from kindergarten. Anyway,
Not from kindergarten. That's been further. No, but the point is that
Yes.
the nature of business has changed, and I think it puts a burden even we intellectuals in Massachusetts. It's hard to get a good job for anybody today.
That's right.
And that creates angry people, and especially in the hinterlands, with the devastated. If you go 40 miles out of Boston to Worcester or Brockton or whatever, you see devastated.
Those are my towns, man. Those are my towns. I taught in Worcester for 12 years, and I've been in Brockton for almost 8.
10% unemployment.
But let me suggest something.
But I'm saying the problem goes beyond public policy. It's not that simple.
Well, yes and no. I mean, yes, it goes beyond public policy, but part of what I'm talking about here are economic policies, globalization, the rise of a kind of neoliberal philosophy that is part of this kind of kill it to save it policymaking. It's not just political policy. I'm talking about economic policy as well. And part of what you're saying is part of what I'm trying to document, right? Which is that in the 1960s, right, we're coming off of World War II, we're coming off of the expansion of the public sector by leaps and bounds, right? And so the idea that people could, in fact, find a decent living in that system was true. But it was also based on a kind of foreign policy and imperialism that was going to rip it apart eventually. Because as soon as we could move production elsewhere, that's what we did. And that really undercut the entire kind of fallacy of the idea that that was sustainable. Now the other thing, and I've been teaching a lot about this lately in rediscovering Mario Savio's speech on the steps of Farrell Hall in 1964, if you think about the critique that the New Left was constructing about the corporate university and the rise of the knowledge economy and the role that the university played, and I have a chapter on higher ed in here that I think is according to Jerry quite good. So if Jerry Lemke says it's good, I'm just saying. I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying it's good. Is that part of the critique that Savio suggests is that if the university is a corporation and the faculty are the workers, then the students are the raw material. And the students refuse to be raw material. And when the operating of the machine becomes so odious, you have to throw your body on the wheels and the gears to keep it from working. Because if you can't be a human being, then you're not going to let the machine work at all. Now, I would say we lost that. I would say now, and this is the end of the semester, so anyone who teaches seniors knows this, that all the seniors come in all dressed up in their uniforms because they're interviewing for jobs, right? And they're so proud of the fact that they're graduating and they're going to get jobs. At Stonehill it's like WB Mason and Enterprise Rental Car, but they're coming in and they're saying, "Oh, we're going, we're ready for that." It's like I am a finished commodity now. Look how bright and shiny I am. Now, can I get a job? And so, it's scary to be a part of that machine in which the students not only are they not willing to throw their body on the machine because the workings of it are so odious, but in fact they're thankful for having gotten processed as effectively as they have been so that they can get a decent job. So that's the paradigm shift that has occurred, and that's the paradigm shift I think we need to attack and challenge.
Yes. I want to know how we can create a multicultural, forget multicultural, a multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition, right? And we know, right, in this moment in time, we see social movements happening, right? Mm-hmm. But they lack racial ethnic diversity. The women's movement lacked racial diversity. The Science March lacked racial diversity. This room lacks racial diversity. So how do we go about to create kind of a multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition?
Did you want to?
That's not true. You could join the Green Party right here, go to Boston. That's owned by Dr. Malking. So you could join the Green Party.
Well, so there's your answer. Next.
I feel like a lot of people would disagree.
Yes, I think a lot of people would disagree. I think there's a lot of room for debate. But I think you're absolutely right about, the lack of that, right? The interracial movement of the poor, right? I mean, but I think one of the issues is that we're going to have this conversation over a beer later. But one of the issues I think is that on the one hand, we're starting to see that breakdown in groups like Black Lives Matter. And, I actually think that in different communities around the country, Occupy Wall Street was much more multicultural than people give it credit for. Not everywhere. Oakland it was. There are many places around the country that it was. I think that one of the strongest things about Black Lives Matter and a lot of the material that they've been putting out over the last year or so is incredibly sharp in its critique. Kind of multi-level and integrated critique of both capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy. So I think it's possible. One of the things I try to encourage my students, and is actually I do have a little bit on Black Lives Matter and the rise of things like school to prison pipeline and other crime and justice issues, especially as it's focused on race, and suggest that one of the narratives we really need to promote, I think, is that Black Lives Matter is all lives matter. It ought not be juxtaposed with all lives matter. That's what it is. And the more we actually promote that paradigm, suggesting that that these are issues that focus on all of us, right? We know who's getting killed, but that in fact it's not only about complicity, but it's also about the degradation of civic life. And if we can't control, policing, if we can't control these issues, in part through public policy, but not only through public policy, then we all lose. So what I was going to say, which I'd love to talk to you more about, is what do we do? So I'm putting the question back at you, right? Can we start organizing and keep organizing while we maintain the criticism instead of wondering why we don't have it yet? And to me, that's always been one of the powers of any social movement that I've been a part of. And I will be honest, it generally happens more locally than it does, on a bigger level. And unfortunately, I missed most of the, real big social movements of the 60s and 70s that my mentors tell me bedtime stories about. You see people working together, and they work through some of those issues. They argue with one another, right? When I wrote about the custodial workers in the Hamptons in my first book, one of the things that was amazing about that group was how much they fought with one another about racial issues and ethnic issues in particular. And they stayed together. And as one guy, Percy, I'll never forget, said, if we can't fight like a family, we'll all be working at Kmart, right? And so those are the spaces that, I find these possibilities come about. Now the question is, could we do it in a room like this? We could start. But, we have to be committed to disagreement. We have to be committed to being challenged. Especially, for years, right, white activists have had to be able to be schooled, right? And many people don't want to spend time schooling other people. So I totally get it. But we have to have these conversations and we have to have these disagreements if we're going to actually change the paradigm.
We have time for one or two more.
One or two more. Okay.
So the bottom line is, you go to your politician, and at the end of the day, he needs to listen to the person that's going to bring in the money to pay for infrastructure, to pay. Because how are you going to pay for things if you don't have somebody coming in with the money bags? Okay. Mm-hmm. So how do you go over that? How do you strategize that?
Let me see what I got. I have
Okay, so I'll listen to you.
So there you go. See? Wow, you're easy. So yeah,
They all
no.
are. They all
Well,
politicians are. You know, whoever comes in with the money, and you know, I'm a developer. You know, this is what I'm going to do. Here's money. You know.
that's right. Well,
Corey, can you repeat the question?
Maybe. I think the question is, what can you do if politicians are always looking for the money, and the people with money are the ones who can do the projects they might want to do anyway. So don't you have to kind of accept that? And I mean, yeah, always. Well, I mean, I guess if always we accept that, you know, then you know, please just buy a lot of the books so you know I can do better and send my kids to a better school. But actually, I only get about $2 for the books. I don't know what this is about. Why am I here? I think the issue is that no, it's not always like that, and I would argue that there are many examples, both globally and in the United States as a whole, when we've had movements that actually changed this to some degree. We're in a particular moment right now where it looks like it's, you know, what could you possibly do? But you know, if you want to go back, I don't think you could find too many people in the South in 1949 that thought, you know, oh, you know what, in a couple of years there's going to be a huge bus boycott in New Orleans. And then a couple of years after that there's going to be a huge bus boycott in Montgomery. And then suddenly you're going to have a civil rights movement that changes the racial makeup of much of American politics, even if not long-lasting and completely changed. So, I mean, I just think it's always easy to say we can't change anything because that's the way it is. But history proves us mostly wrong. Brother Bob, you were going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say that I don't think that Bernie lost because he didn't have enough money.
Well, that's another
And the fact of the matter is that new technologies and new techniques of organizing have managed to raise lots of money in small amounts from lots of people, and that's a great equalizer. And there's period.
Period. Thank you. All right, last question from Jerry Lepke. Even though my wife was the other one with her hand up. You'll have an opportunity.
Well,
maybe.
Since I was going to end with a bedtime story.
Yeah, please.
Maybe your wife would be better for it. I don't know.
No. I think a bedtime story would be nice.
Well, nobody just said, and maybe I'm the one to say it since I've read most of the book already. Thank you for a great book. And I think that one of the real merits of the book, you kind of alluded before to the fact that there are other people who are writing about similar things, but I think that the title of your book, Kill It to Save It or Killing It to Save It, really kind of carves out a niche for you and draws attention to the kind of demagoguery that's out there in the neoliberal approach. Right? It's simultaneously all about somehow saving the system, saving capitalism, saving America, while simultaneously killing the very things that are essential and fundamental to America. And I think that's what you do here. And to my mind, and I'll end here, the keystone chapters here are on education. Again, you mentioned that, but the most powerful chapters here, and I think that one of the things that really, one of the touchstones of this book is that in the 1990s, Lehman Brothers, the investment banking institution, Lehman Brothers issued this report, and it was a kind of a strategy to do the same thing with education in America that they had done with healthcare in America. It was very explicit. You lay it out in here, right? To privatize higher education, to profitize higher education the same way that they had done with healthcare in America. And not just higher education, but public school education, and also, for that matter, a lot of private colleges and private educational institutions that are integrated with religious and other organizations, and to free them from those bonds and open them up to the market, right? And open them up to capitalist management in the way that they haven't been. I've taught at Holy Cross College in Worcester for 25 years, right? Holy Cross, by statute, still must have a Jesuit president. Right? The Jesuits still run Holy Cross. Lehman Brothers wants to free Holy Cross from the Jesuits. Right? They want to turn Holy Cross College into a marketable commodity. Right? And if you are in education, if you are a teacher, public school teacher, any kind of teacher, a professor, if you're a student, if you got kids in school, you've got to read these chapters. Right? These chapters are for you. They'll spin
We'll have an extra order. Let me just say that one of the things that's so striking about the Lehman report that I talk about, I think, is, I know I talk about it, I think it's most is that the strategy suggests, and this gets to the idea that, well, what if we just revamp capitalism? You know, even Robert Wright, you know, for the insight he often has for certain strategies, you know, he still says we're going to save capitalism from itself, right? You know, the idea of Lehman Brothers was that this investment would work because the private sector will solve the problems better than anyone else, right? And what's so important about that perspective is that they haven't. But they still made a shitload of money. Sorry, Ruby. And sorry, Chris, too. So, you know, the idea that in fact the ideology is such that our private sector knows how to do this stuff better. And so if you unleash it from the necessity of the public sector and public control and that, you know, ugly, dirty thing we call democracy that's supposed to make sure that it's accountable, it doesn't matter. You know, the election of Trump was simply to get rid of the middleman. Right? I mean, corporate hegemony just decided, why do we keep giving all this money to politicians? Let's just elect us, right? Now, of course, he happens to be, you know, his own, you know, eccentric, narcissistic, pathological self. But what he represents is pretty obvious, right? It's pretty obvious. So that notion that a paradigm is such that we need to challenge it is something that I think, if I do anything in the book, is try to expose and suggest alternatives. So thank you, Jerry. I want to thank again everyone from the bookstore. 5 books, not just mine, but 5 books here.